and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program coming to you live on CGTN. We begin with the latest on Venezuela's political crisis. The South American nation has turned out to be another battleground for geopolitical influence between the U.S. and Russia. On Monday, Russian Foreign Minister Sergey Lavrov and U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo met in Finland while the opposition mounted a failed military action against President Nicolas Maduro earlier last week. Before we get down to the discussion, let's take a look at this.
Venezuela teetering on the edge as tensions flare between Russia and the U.S. Russian Foreign Minister Sergey Lavrov and U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo discussed the future of Venezuela in Finland on the sidelines of the 11th ministerial meeting of the Arctic Council.
During my contacts with my American, European and South American colleagues, I did not see any supporters of reckless military solution. I hope this overall understanding will be put into practice and there will be no military solution because it will be catastrophic.
I made clear our view that the Venezuelans deserve a democracy that doesn't have any foreign party running their country or involved in their country on a consistent basis in a military way, right? So we want the Cubans out, we want the Iranians out, we want the Russians military out.
The two sides have been at odds over Venezuela. In the past few months, Washington repeatedly urged Moscow to cease its support for President Nicolas Maduro, while Moscow stressed that Washington's interference in the internal affairs of a sovereign state and threat against its leadership is a gross violation of international law. Just one day before Mr. Lavrov and Mr. Pompeo's meeting, the Russian foreign minister also met with his Venezuelan counterpart, Jorge Arriaza, in Moscow on Sunday. Russia has deep military cooperation with Venezuela. It sent a group of military advisors this year as tensions grew.
We are prepared for any scenario. The first being one of diplomacy, one of dialogue of peace. We reach our hands out to everyone in the world to talk, but if they opt for a military option, we have an armed force, a people, a national guard that would be able not only to resist and fight, but even win and defeat any army, no matter how powerful. I hope, however, that this scenario never arises.
Mr. Arriaza also accused the U.S. of backing a failed coup attempt initiated by opposition leader Juan Guaido at the end of April, as Mr. Pompeo spoke about the possibility of military action and how the U.S. is ready to press the military button last week. The Venezuelan military leadership has since reiterated its support for the government, and President Maduro also urged soldiers to be ready to defend the homeland.
Ongoing political crisis in Venezuela. What's next? In our Beijing studio, Professor Jiang Shixue, the director of the Center for Latin American Studies from the Shanghai University. He is now in Beijing. In Caracas, we have Phil Gunson, who is a senior analyst from the International Crisis Group. Meanwhile, in Moscow, Mark Sloboda, an international relations and security analyst. Last but not least, in Washington, D.C., we are joined by Mary Cruz McGowan, the Vice President of the National Economist Club, and she is originally coming from Latin America. I want to welcome the four of you. Of course, we know you have very different opinions from one another as to the realities on the ground and the solutions. That is exactly why we need to discuss. I want to go to you first, Mr. Gunson. Coming from the International Crisis Group, which is believed by some as a more pro-West group, what do you make of the latest situation, particularly Mr. Guaido apparently losing political stakes in the last attempt for a military coup, or rather for a political coup, shall we say it that way?
Yes, the events last week certainly didn't help the opposition cause. They didn't really help Mr. Maduro either. I think, in a way, both sides are losers, and of course the Venezuelan people are losers to the extent that none of this has produced a political solution, which is the only way that we're going to solve this tremendous economic crisis and the humanitarian tragedy that it's caused. So on the ground, things are at least as complicated as they were before last Tuesday, and possibly even more so. It's reassuring in a way that the Russians and the Americans are getting together to try to talk about this, but on the other hand, it's a shame that it's reached that stage.
Ms. McGowan, coming from your perspective now living in the U.S., what do you make of the dwindling supporting rate of Mr. Guaido from the early January, let's just say, according to some local survey, 80% approval rating, to now about 50 to 60%? What does it say?
Well, he's right. He's constitutionally there. He was the president of the assembly. He was following the constitution, is the interim president of Venezuela. That's something important to stress. You know, he's not there to stay. He's going to call elections as soon this crisis passes. But yeah, they didn't plan very well. I think they had a commitment of certain military leaders, which didn't happen at the last moment. Obviously, that created a sense of doubt and a sense of despair on the populations that were supporting him. That was not good news, as my colleague said, for either side. Now, I think something I would like to say, I don't think President Maduro is the problem here. He's the face of the crisis, but he's not the problem, because the problem existed even before he came. It just got worse, obviously, and under his leadership, of lack of leadership, I would say. Things are just horrendous in Venezuela. People are starving, and that has to stop. But what is important to stress is that Venezuela is not only fighting for their democracy, but for their independence. There are too many Cubans there. I think we should say that about $25,000 Cubans, according to the source you have, that are in the country, and there are the forces that are not stabilizing the peace there. Those people have to go back to the country.
All right. I'm not sure whether 25,000 people from Cuba or anywhere else is likely to make the country disable to function in the way that it did recently, particularly. But let me go to you, Mr. Sloboda. Of course, coming in Russia, you have a very different view from our possibly two Earths. But the question really is, no matter which side is Russia supporting, it is not helpful to have outside interference in a country that is struggling within itself. Is it, Mr. Sloboda?
Yes, Anita.
Well, first of all, we have to point out that this fig leaf that the U.S. is using to justify trying to put their Muppet in charge of Venezuela and its largest proven oil reserves in the world, a fig leaf of a constitutional article, is complete nonsense. That article only provides for an interim president appointed by the National Assembly between the election and the inauguration if he is physically incapacitated or missing. So there's absolutely no constitutional grounds for this this fig leaf of justification for the U.S.-backed coup there. Not that the U.S. has any business interpreting the Venezuelan constitution at all. And the question of outside influence, certainly, I mean, we're talking a U.S.-backed coup attempt. This is a flagrant and brazen violation of international law that we have seen repeatedly by the United States in a whole train wreck of states around the world, from Iraq to Libya to Syria, that it has destroyed. However, the Russian government is there under the express invitation of the Venezuelan government. The sovereign state of Venezuela, its government, has the right to choose its allies under international law as it does. And it has good relations with Russia, China, Cuba, Nicaragua, and a whole host of other states that aren't trying to overthrow its government.
All right, Mr. Jiang, also your input here. We have a very mixed picture right now. The current administration obviously is having difficulties to govern under the current circumstances, and yet the Mr. Guaido, which has been termed by some as so-called the Western puppet, is not winning more hearts, but rather losing more hearts. And the most important thing, Mr. Jiang, is this country is in crisis, and people are suffering as a result. So what do you think can be the role of the international community? On the one hand, not to interfere and taking sides in others' internal affairs, which China apparently holds very firm of. But on the other hand, be able to help or at least ease the pain of the situation, Mr. Jiang.
Well, I would totally agree with our panelist from Moscow. First of all, I would say that the UN...
In terms of what?
In terms of his argument.
About?
About the current situation, how to deal with this kind of a current crisis.
What is your way of dealing with the crisis?
Well, you know, first of all, the U.S. should stop imposing economic sanctions against Venezuela. Secondly, the U.S. should keep its hands off Venezuela. The final solution to the crisis is in the hands of the Venezuelan people. Okay, so Maduro was elected by the people in Venezuela. Guaido was appointed by the U.S., so to speak. So we can understand who is in the right position.
Mr. Guaido, before the crisis happened, he is the leader of the parliament of that country.
Well, according to, as our colleague from Moscow said, we need to understand the so-called constitution in the right way. Okay, so his appointment was against the constitution of Venezuela, a sovereign country in South America. Okay, so external interference should stop. Economic sanctions should stop. Let's ask the people in Venezuela to decide who will be the leader.
So you're proposing an election? Is that what you're saying, or what exactly is the solution you've been talking about?
People in Venezuela will tell you do this or do that.
Well, so without governance, it's very hard to solicit opinions, isn't it? Just to put that opinion right here. But Mr. Gunson, if you could hear me well, can you? Wonderful, sir. So tell me about some of the latest development. One is the U.S. is trying to impose sanctions on the court leader of Venezuela. Secondly, the U.S. is trying to, likely the Vice President of the U.S. is going to make a speech about that too, giving incentives to the military who are supporting Mr. Guaido rather than the current president of Venezuela. Obviously, both of these measures, if taken place, is likely to interfere even more about the realities on the ground. The question really is, does interference lead us to solutions at all? As the Russian panelists earlier rightfully argued about some of the recent cases in which the U.S. get involved, starting from Iraq all the way up to now, and did not succeed. Mr. Gunson, from your perspective.
Well, we certainly have a lot of issues with the way in which the United States is handling this. We were against oil sanctions. We're against rattling sabers, if you like, threatening military intervention. We're certainly against a military intervention as such. We don't think it's useful that the United States government should suggest that this is all about a left-right battle between socialism and capitalism. This is about, as your other guests have said, allowing the Venezuelan people to have their say. The problem is that Mr. Maduro hasn't allowed the Venezuelan people to have their say in a free and fair election. So the issue at the moment is how to get to the point where there can be a genuine election and the will of the people can be allowed to prevail. That's not easy. It's not complicated. This has been a long time in coming. The institutions have broken down. But I think rather than interference, what's needed is help from the outside. Venezuelans won't be able to fix this on their own. That's been proven over the last 2 decades.
So you are saying to me, it seems, Mr. Gunson, rather than one layer of difficulties of trying to figure out the way forward by the Venezuelan people themselves, there's another layer of difficulty they have to handle now, which is to handle the so-called outside interference coming from the biggest powers in the world. So not only the first goal is not being achieved, but rather they have more burdens to handle at the time of crisis. Is that what you're trying to say, Mr. Gunson?
Not exactly, but close to that. I think, in fact, there are three layers. There's the Venezuelan crisis itself, there's the regional impact, and now we have the great powers involved. Now, that having happened, now it's clear that Russia, that China, that the United States all have interests in Venezuela, that this is not going to be fixed unless somehow those interests are reconciled. And it's in that sense that I think it's positive that Pompeo and Lavrov get together. But of course, what we want is a situation in which the interests of the Venezuelans prevail, that they predominate, and this isn't simply a deal stitched up between Washington and Moscow.
Right. Well, that certainly is one of those opinions quite popular these days, but let's take a look at another aspect of things. For example, what's going on within the U.S. politics and therefore having its impact on its possible approach toward the current crisis in Venezuela. There are speculations, according to some media reports, that President Trump is out of step with his own advisors on the role Russia is playing in the crisis and some of the other issues as well. When Mr. Trump said the Russian president is not looking at all to get involved in Venezuela, other than he'd like to see something positive for Venezuela. Secretary Pompeo and National Security Advisor John Bolton accused Russia and Cuba of maneuvering to keep Maduro clinging to power, quote unquote. Now, the issue is not about what I'm trying to say here. Whether Russia is involved or not, we're going to ask our Russian expert about that. But the issue really here is, Ms. McGowan, since you are in the U.S. right now, whether the current administration is having a concerted policy toward Venezuela, or they're having daily divisions about their approach, which would mean adding more pressure about unpredictability from one of the biggest powers in the world, Washington, toward what's going on in Venezuela. Ms. McGowan.
Well, this is a very difficult issue, obviously, something that cannot be solved. But one thing is important. The United States doesn't want for this to lead to an international military conflict.
No. May I just ask my question again? You're not answering my question, I'm afraid, Ms. McGowan. My question really is there division within the administration, and it's apparent on a daily basis almost, what to approach and how to approach the Venezuela crisis, including whether Russia is involved or not, even among the administration officials? That is the question.
No. There is the president. The president has the last word. He consults, and also Congress has an opinion. That's not a division. It's just people are talking, people are negotiating, people are trying to see what will be the best solution from different areas of the government, but of course the president has the last word. He's the commander-in-chief if this gets to something more serious. But that doesn't mean there is a division. There are discussions, and I think those are healthy discussions. The president is not a dictator. He's the president. He has to consult with his advisors. He has to consult with both branches of Congress. He has to see the legality. He has to see the pros and cons. He has to see not only the political side, but the economic side. So that's what he's doing. It is a very difficult problem. And addressing to what my colleagues my colleague from Russia said, let's say this is a sovereign, legitimate government from President Maduro. Obviously, President Maduro's government, as legitimate as he thinks it is doing a terrible job, because people are starving, and people are not starving after the sanctions that the U.S. put. The U.S. put those sanctions because people are suffering, people are starving, they don't have medicines, they don't have health.
So you're saying that there should be more rounds of sanctions against the people in Venezuela because they are already starving? Is that what you're saying, Ms. McGowan?
No, I am saying that the sanctions are coming to the people in Venezuela that are causing this problem, not to the people of Venezuela.
Okay.
The United States has been a step front, providing food, providing medicines, and everybody saw that, and the neighboring countries too. And even we have records that President Maduro was not allowing for that aid to reach its own people. So if that's good leadership, I don't know.
Let me have the Russian counterpart, Mr. Sloboda, to also respond to that. Okay, Mr. Sloboda, make sure you are responding toward a limited time, okay? And because we have more questions for you. Briefly respond, please.
Yes. Of course, this is nonsense. A report by the renowned U.S. economists Jeffrey Sachs and Mark Weisbrot have identified that the illegal and unilateral U.S. sanctions and economics warfare that topple the government in Venezuela have resulted directly in the deaths of 40,000 people. 40,000 people. And that's directly linked to the U.S.'s illegal economic sanctions and economic warfare that need to be lifted. And the U.S. needs to return to international law. And secondly, of course, Venezuela had free and fair elections. The opinion of the International Crisis Group flies in the face of international operators, and denying legitimacy and denying agency to the people of foreign countries is a standard tactic for the United States, saying nothing of their own corrupt and rigged political system.
Okay. So another issue, since we all of you express your opinions, another issue important is, Mr. Jiang, that it's very likely the current administration in Washington would decide on sanctions, on the so-called secondary sanctions, meaning countries and companies and organizations, international or regional, that are dealing with Venezuela, including buying the Venezuela oil or working with the Venezuela projects, are likely to be sanctioned as a result by United States unilaterally. So we see that also, for example, as the U.S. approach toward Iran. U.S. sanctions.
Cuba also Cuba.
U.S. sanctions companies coming from Europe, for example, of doing that, interacting with Iran, even though there were previous nuclear peace agreements, the so-called JCPOA, that all parties agreed upon. So my question to you is, Mr. Jiang, what do you make of that possibility? What does that mean to the current crisis in Venezuela? As we know, 90%, 90, of the export revenue coming from Venezuela are coming from the oil industry.
As you know that in human history, economic sanction has been proved it's useless. Okay, so for the crisis in Venezuela, we can say economic sanction is not good for Venezuela, for the people in this country, and military intervention is not good. The only solution, the only decisive solution to the crisis is political dialogue.
But now, you can say that. You can say that, Mr. Jiang. Mr. Jiang, you can say that. But no, you can't say that. Yes, you can. But the issue is, what if the U.S. did that? And how would the other countries respond if the U.S. took actions like that, unilateral actions?
Well, as you know, that China is criticized by the U.S. for offering all kinds of help for the country of Venezuela. Economic help for Venezuela is good for the people in Venezuela. Economic sanction is not good for Venezuela. So everybody can understand this simple logic. Okay, so just let me finish my conclusion. The only solution to the crisis is through political dialogue. And Maduro said, well, we can sit down and talk. And Guaido said, no, I'm not going to talk to you. You need to step down. So regime change is the only purpose for the U.S. and Guaido, and that's not the solution for the crisis.
If there were political talk, as you mentioned,
yes,
what format will it take? Is there real discussions about that, or is just the solution being thrown out there and say, let's just have political talk?
Well, let's see that some countries, even China, can play a kind of mediation role, you know, for this kind of crisis.
The permanent members of the Security Council, that's what you're trying to propose?
Well, some countries some impartial countries, I think, can play a role as a mediator.
Okay. We also want the other three guests, very briefly, to help us understand what do you think should be the solutions. We have about 30 to 45 seconds for every one of you. Let's go to you, Ms. McGowan.
Well, we should let the Venezuelans to determine the destiny of their own country. Take all the people that are not Venezuelans and not doing business legally in Venezuela to get out of there.
Okay. And Mr. Sloboda, coming from Russia.
Yes, the first thing that needs to happen is the U.S. needs to end its active attempts to overthrow the Venezuelan government. Then it and its allies need to end their illegal and unilateral sanctions without the remit of the UN Security Council against the Venezuelan people. At that point, the Venezuelan people are perfectly capable of solving their own political tensions and difficulties in their country by themselves.
Last but not least, Mr. Gunson, coming from the International Crisis Group.
Yes, I'm afraid they're not. I mean, I'm afraid that's just not true. They haven't been able to do it. Outside help is required. It's not going to come, I hope, in the form of military intervention. That would be disastrous. What is needed is serious negotiation, not dialogue. The government here is continually offering dialogue, but what dialogue means to them is to sit down and talk endlessly while they remain in power. There needs to be something substantive put on the table. And in particular, there needs to be the restoration of the powers of the National Assembly, a new electoral council, and basically a re-institutionalization of the country, if you like, under international supervision.
Certainly complicated, no matter which approach we are talking about proposed by the four of you. But certainly we're going to follow the latest situation on the ground, as this is very important for the people, at least in Venezuela. Thank you so much, the four of you, offering your insights. Phil Gunson, Marcus Sloboda, Mary Cruz McGowan, last but not least, Jiang Shixue. Thank you so much.